I'm Dave Dinkel, and thanks for joining me for this video series of actual recent deals. This is a deal that netted the student $17,452 with no money in the deal. The following is a real estate deal that recently was completed, in this case by a student. The deal exemplifies some of the various aspects of how we do these types of transactions. The uniqueness of this deal was that the seller simply decided, I'm not coming to closing, and that meant we had to do something about getting him there. So as not to embarrass anyone involved in this transaction, all parties have been kept anonymous. I'm not an attorney, CPA, or realtor, and any information derived or found in this presentation is not to be construed as legal or accounting advice. This is the example of an A to B and B to C double closing where the investor used transactional funding to fund the deal, the A to B leg, so he had no money in the deal. The seller A, the homeowner, sold to investor B, and the investor sold again to another investor who is a well-known rehabber in the area. No money in the deal, as none was needed because transactional funding was used for the A to B leg, no credit because no conventional lender was involved, and no risk in the deal because, frankly, the student had no money in the deal. Again, this is an example of what happens when a seller decides he's not coming to closing, and he must be essentially forced to the closing table. Now, this property was bought from the seller direct. It had been listed on the MLS, 4-bedroom, 2 bathrooms, where 2 of the bedrooms and 1 bathroom built without permits, totally illegal. The seller had been caught by the city's code enforcement officer. He was looking at fines in excess of $45,000 that had to be resolved before closing, and they were accruing on a daily basis. Originally, the seller agreed to pay the liens at closing, and the C buyer would rehab the property and bring it up to code. The student negotiated an additional $10,000 price reduction, and it's not a price reduction on the HUD. The reason for that is we want the listing agent to get the full commission. If it was a price reduction, then he would not get a commission on that price reduced amount. So you're going to see it as a repair credit on the HUD. It's very, very important. Anyway, the seller decided he could get more money from another investor, and he frankly decided, I'm not coming to closing. The seller not coming to closing would take the profit out of the deal for the student, but it would also cause a liability between the student and his end buyer C. This is very, very important. If you're doing an A to B and a B to C transaction, you better have a disclaimer in that B to C. In the event you can't get the A seller or can't close the A to B leg, you're not responsible for delivering the property to the C buyer. We immediately tried to negotiate, but the seller would have none of it, because he decided that, in fact, we were ripping him off because we wanted him to pay the lien. He and his attorney went to the city, and the city told him they would take $7,500 as the lien payoff. We were asking for actually $47,000, as it turned out. Now, that's not a guarantee. Somebody at the city who's a clerk may have said that. In reality, the end buyer C may have wound up paying $47,000, which did not turn out to be the case. What we did is we got an attorney and put together a lis penance to foreclose on the property because we had an equitable interest in it because of the signed sales agreement with the original seller. We also had our attorney prepare a breach of contract lawsuit, and we got in touch with the seller by serving him legal notice. The seller came back to the table and closed instead of fighting a lawsuit that his attorney told him he would lose anyway. They did put up a little bit of a struggle for a half a day, claiming all sorts of various things about, the professional investor student was ripping off the seller because the property was worth $350,000. The reality was it had been listed and couldn't be sold for $2.25. We had to have the right buyer to do it. In this case, we did. All right, so now let's look at the HUD closing statement, A to B, first leg, page 1. The student investor in this case contracted the property for $210,000. That was also the seller's price that he would receive, less, of course, various expenses. On the student side, those expenses amounted to $2,696 even. We're going to see those on page 2. Now, this is what's important. Notice what the deposit is on this transaction for the investor. 0. I keep saying this. You guys keep telling me earnest money deposit. The contract's not legal if you don't have it. It is legal for good and valuable consideration as well as the escrow deposit. Some attorneys will not agree with me. Some realtors will not agree with me, but the courts have agreed with me. This is the expenses for the seller, $20,573.11. Seems like pretty substantial, but we're going to see them on page 2. Okay, repair credit. Remember I said to you a couple moments ago Student got a $10,000 price reduction. There it is, listed as a repair credit. It's much more palatable to the agent to say, show it as a repair credit, so he gets paid on the full amount, the $210,000 purchase price, rather than a purchase price of $200,000. Difference is $600 or so to him. Whenever you have a credit on the HUD statement, this is a balance sheet, so you have an offsetting debit. So there's the debit to the seller. That reduced the proceeds from the sale. Now the seller actually was not upside down. He just decided to sell. And here is his payoff on his mortgage. Here's the credit that we agreed to with the seller. So it's a debit to him and a credit to us on the other side, of course. So that's what he was told by the city, $7,500. And you'll see on the B2C that we had our end buyer agree to a credit of $9,000. So here's the accrued interest from the beginning of the year to the actual closing date. For the seller, it's a debit, and for us as the buyer, it's a credit. So the bottom line was the investor had to have cash to close of $192,601.31, and the net proceeds to the seller were $49,330.20, minus whatever legal fees he had with his attorney. So now let's go to page 2 of the HUD. This is the A to B side again. We're going to look at what the expenses were. Now the seller paid the commission to the realtor, and there it is, $12,600. As you can see over here, it was 6%. These are the settlement or closing fees to the student as well as the seller. Our closing agent did both the A to B and the B to C transaction. The abstract or title search was paid by the seller. Here's the attorney's fees. Now they're on the buyer's side. The reason being, we're the ones that had the attorney do the legal work for us. There's how he got paid. Here's the title insurance, which we paid for. These are doc stamps, transfer stamps. These are the fees that are the bottom line on the expenses that the seller had to pay. And you can see them over here. Tax collector, water and sewer again, code lien violations. And this was the total amount of all of them. So the net result of this, and we saw it on the first page, the seller had to have a deduction of expenses, $20,573.11. Student had $26.96 even for his side. Now we're going to look at the closing statement for the second leg of the transaction, our B2C, page 1. What's interesting about this, student, ourselves, and the interested buyer went out to the house, and the buyer said, how much are you asking? Now we were going to ask $235, but the student blurted out that no, he got it for $210. So the end buyer said, I'm not going to pay $235, I'll pay $225. Seeing as how we were getting close to the end of the inspection period, everything else didn't have another buyer quickly, went ahead and took it. But the point is open mouth, foot in the mouth costs the student 10 grand. So be careful about who you're talking to and what you're saying, especially if you have an open house and you're talking to other people at the same time. There's the $225,000 that the end buyer C is paying. Remember, buyer on this side, seller on this side. Of course, the seller, which is now the student, received a $225,000 credit, less the expenses. We'll see what his profit is. For the end buyer C, closing costs for $2,148. And look at this. The end buyer put up a $5,000 earnest money deposit. In the event we didn't close on the B2C, we would have made $5,000 on the transaction. These are the expenses for the seller. They're $2,850, which are low for this type of price transaction. All remember, much of this has been paid on the A to B leg in terms of the code violations and everything else. This is the code enforcement lien credit that we gave to the end buyer. So we actually took a $2,000 reduction on this simply because we wanted to get it settled. And there is it's $9,500, and there is the debit to us. These are the accrued taxes. Again, they're the same as the A to B leg, simply because they came on the same day. This is the funding investment. In other words, that's the transactional funding amount that had to be paid off. There's the other side of the taxes, which were a debit to the seller. Again, a credit to the buyer. The net result was that the end buyer C, who's going to rehab the property, wound up having to bring $210,000 and change to closing to complete the transaction. That's because of credits he had, as well as the deposit he already had up. And this is the seller's, the student's, net profit on the deal, which is $17,452.00, coincidentally. So here's page 2. We're going to run through these expenses for both the student and the end buyer. There's the settlement charges by the closing agent. These are attorney's fees for the end buyer because he chose to have the property shadowed by his own attorney. So the closing costs for that were put onto the HUD statement. He also paid the title insurance. Even though we chose the closing agent, he paid the title policy. These are doc stamps that we paid because seller pays as usual, customary in our area. This is the funding fee. This is the transactional fee that the student paid to the person that did the transactional funding of $190,000. The bottom line is the student paid $2,850 in expenses. The end buyer C had $2,148 in expenses. So the final result of this transaction, this is a case where the seller simply decided, I'm not coming to closing, which normally would be a serious problem. We took a very aggressive stance to bring the seller back to the closing table because we had an enforceable contract agreement, not only with the original seller, but unfortunately with the end buyer C, so we had to be careful. Now, we had a clause in there that said if we can't do the A to B leg, we're not responsible for the B to C leg. Seller came to closing after a day of bantying back and forth between our attorney and his attorney. As you saw, the attorney's costs were included on the HUD 1 B to C leg. Student's net profit for this no out-of-pocket money deal, $17,452 by using transactional funding to close the A to B leg. Thanks very much for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you on our next weekly series of recent deals.